In this video lecture, we will visualize the concept of oxidation and reduction, and we will also be discussing the process of glycolysis. So this is an overview of all of the chemical reactions happening inside the cell, otherwise known as the metabolism of the cell. So this is just an overview, meaning to say we are just considering here the major chemical reactions in the metabolism of the cell. Now going to the left, as shown in the blue arrow, we have here the formation of macromolecules such as the lipids, polysaccharides, and proteins from their monomer constituents. So this building up of biological material in the cell is known as anabolism. And notice here that in order for the cell to build macromolecules, such as proteins, for example, that cell needs to expend or to use energy in the form of ATP, the energy currency of the cell. While going to the right, wherein this is the direction wherein the cell is actually digesting or breaking down those macromolecules to become smaller molecules. This one is known as catabolism. Notice the outputs of catabolism here include carbon dioxide, water, and ammonia. And take note also that in catabolism, ATP is formed from the energy that is released when the bonds of the macromolecule monomers are broken. So, catabolism equates to the making of energy by breaking the bonds of macromolecules. So, all of these processes happen synchronously inside the cell. So, let's have a visual representation of reduction and oxidation. In this illustration, we're going to consider the reduction and oxidation states of carbon, the atom carbon. So first, we start here from the left, labeled most reduced state of carbon, which is methane. And then we go to the right, carbon dioxide, which is labeled here as the most oxidized state. Okay. So take note of the arrangement of the electrons as shown here on the bonds of carbon and hydrogen in methane. The electrons are sort of pulled more towards carbon because carbon has a stronger pull on electrons than the hydrogen atoms have. And therefore, carbon sort of has more of these 8 electrons than the hydrogen atoms surrounding it. So take note when we speak of reduced, meaning to say it has more of these electrons. And the illustration here shows just that. Now let's go to methanol. In methanol, we have replaced one of the hydrogen atoms with a hydroxyl group, which now bears oxygen. And we know that oxygen is very electronegative. So if ever it's present, notice the location of the electrons now between carbon and the hydroxyl portion of the molecule. Take note that the oxygen has pulled the electrons away, farther away from carbon. Therefore, we can say carbon sort of lost its hold to those electrons, and carbon is now more oxidized than it was when it was in methane. Then we go here to formaldehyde, wherein there is a carbonyl group. So take note of the double bond between the carbon and the oxygen. The electrons are all pulled towards oxygen, a very electronegative atom, thereby reducing the influence of carbon to these electrons. And therefore, carbon is now more oxidized in formaldehyde than it was in methanol. Then we have formic acid here to the right. Take note also that the oxygen in the carbonyl group and in the hydroxyl group have pulled the electrons, now 6 electrons, farther away from carbon, so that carbon is now even more oxidized. And finally, we have carbon dioxide, where 2 oxygen atoms are attached to the carbon atom via double bonds. And notice the position of the electrons are now really towards the oxygen, leaving carbon sort of missing the hold on these electrons. And therefore, carbon in carbon dioxide is in its most oxidized state. So another thing to take note about these is when oxygen is present in the molecule, such as in carbon dioxide, its hold on the electrons is near to indestructible. Okay? Or it's very impossible to remove these electrons that have been captured by oxygen's electronegativity away from its hold. So therefore, you would expect that it's very difficult to break a carbon dioxide molecule by breaking the bonds. However, for methane, because carbon has all the holds here of the electrons, and carbon, although it's electronegative, it is not as electronegative as oxygen. Therefore, its hold to these electrons are not that strong as oxygen's. These bonds between carbon and the hydrogen atoms may be broken. And let's now look at the structure of a triglyceride. Triglyceride is made up of a majority of carbon and hydrogen, hydrocarbons, okay, that are attached to the glycerol backbone. And these many structures of carbon and hydrogen is a reminder that fats, like this one shown here, triglycerides, are in their most reduced state. If you compare that to carbohydrates like glycogen and starch, here's the monosaccharide of carbohydrates. So this one is a sugar. And notice that this is reminiscent of how methanol's carbon is okay, in terms of oxidation state. Because there are hydroxyl groups that are all over this molecule. Therefore, we say that fats such as this triacyl glyceride are more reduced than carbohydrates. And therefore, pound per pound, weight per weight, contains more bonds that may be broken to provide energy to the cell than carbohydrates do. So again, the more reduced a substance is, the more ability it has to become a fuel. So for example, in the illustration here above, methane may be burned. Okay, it may catch fire because it's a fuel. But carbon dioxide, as you can see here to the right, which is the most oxidized of the carbons, is technically stable and cannot be burnt anymore. So notice here also that in the structures of proteins and nucleic acids, that they are not as reduced as the fats. Therefore, although the cell may get energy from these molecules, the best choice would still be either the fats, the lipids, particularly triglycerides, or the carbohydrates.